So let's talk about your project now. Kenneth, tell us about the impact of place-based learning on school culture and student engagement.
Okay. Well, we did a project where we looked into the history of our town, Jenkins, Kentucky, where our school is. And basically, we went back to the beginning of Jenkins. It is a coal town, coal camp. And Consolidated Coal came in, and we found out, that they had a very, very high quality coal that was good for many things. It was good for making steel. And at this time, I think it was 1912, we're getting a boom in industry in our nation. And, Jenkins ultimately ends up playing a big role, and it's really not recognized for that. But, I wanted to dig deeper because when I came to Jenkins as a teacher, I noticed that our students kind of had, I just sensed a feeling of inferiority. And I wanted to build that back up because I'm not from Jenkins, but I'm just from a few miles down the road. And I remember, Jenkins because, I am a little bit older than most beginning teachers. And I do remember back, when Jenkins was still kind of on top economically. And, the loss of coal has had a big economic impact. And I think that is directly related to that feeling that our students get of inferiority. But I felt like going back to the past and letting my students see the people that came here, from all over the world to work. They were strong people, they were proud people. And, it's just very important that we get back and reconnect with that in order to re-establish that sense of pride that used to be.
Well, now I noticed that you chose place-based education for a reason. So why did you choose place-based learning as the format that you did this project with?
Well, first and foremost, like it says, I wanted to connect our class back to the community, because you can come into Jenkins like we've talked about before, and when you come into Jenkins, you're in Cavalier country. Matter of fact, when you come off of the exit off of 23, that's the first thing you see is a big sign that says Cavalier country. And I wanted to get, that's a first step for me to get everybody back to that Cavalier pride. Our students did end up developing a sense of pride themselves in the history, and they kind of realized how important that our history was. And also through this, I think that my students are now better able to be more, think critically, I guess you could say, when approaching various subjects, not just history. I think it's been good for them as students in general.
Mm-hmm. Well, this slide here talks a lot about what you talked about, but one thing I thought that was very interesting. So if you could talk about this final point here about that immigrants came from around the world. So that was one thing that you had mentioned. What was one way that your students learned that about all the people and where they came from?
Okay, we were lucky enough to get a district grant for Ancestry.com, and my students just had a blast getting on Ancestry and looking up, and it was kind of unbelievable. And a lot of my students ended up finding out a lot about their family history that they had no idea about, and that was just so neat to see those kids and watch them. They would just sometimes light up when they would find this stuff out, and they didn't really realize that people, where the people all did come from, and we ended up linking that into a lot of other stuff in kind of side conversations. Even like with there's several famous bluegrass musicians from Jenkins, and we talked to some people, and really when you look at that, and this is just kind of an example of all the different cultures, when you break down the individual instruments in a bluegrass band, they kind of represent all the cultures that came over to work in the mines. And it's kind of like I told them, you can imagine they're sitting up on the number one hill, and the guy up on top of the hill is playing a mandolin. He's from Italy, you know, and the guy from Africa is down there playing his banjo. And they decide to get together. And, you know, then the guy from Ireland comes over with his fiddle. So it was all kind of neat to put all that stuff together.
And I think one thing, when you talked about creating historians in your grant, you've got 3 important points up here. You talked already about the researching and ancestry a little bit, but I thought it was so interesting about how you connected to historical documents and what the students ended up doing with that, and the oral histories and guest speakers. Can you talk about both of those very briefly?
Yes, my students, when we finally got started on our timeline, they just came to life. I mean, they would go in, they would get like old newspapers. They would go and talk to family members. We looked at yearbooks, and we are lucky enough to have a very good community collection down in town at the Railroad Museum. And also, what was the other thing you wanted me to talk about?
Oral histories and the guest speakers.
Oh yes, our oral history. We had a few people come in to talk to us. Probably the most notable one that we had was probably Jesse Wells, and he is actually works in the Appalachian Department down at Morehead State, and we had a really good interview with him, and the kids really enjoyed that.
That's great. So as you talk about the student engagement and student learning that took place with this grant, tell us a little bit about the things that you purchased with the grant and how that made a difference for you.
Okay, we got an iPad, which was huge for us to be able to access different things, and also to be able to record things. There's just so much you can do with an iPad, and that was a big purchase for us. We also got an external hard drive that we use. We're a Google school, and we are continuing to archive with Google Docs. But also, when I run across something that's kind of unique or special, I like to put it on that external hard drive, because that will be something that we can leave behind maybe after we're all gone for future students or historians to look at. And also, the big thing that we're going to purchase, we kind of have it picked out. We found 10 unique photos at the Railroad Museum. And what we plan on doing is having those prints made, and in our entryway at the school, we're going to put the photos up and have plaques with descriptions of the pictures. And I think that's really great, not only for our students to see when they come in, but for other people to see when they come in. And, you know, maybe that will change some attitudes as well.
And I think that's so important. That's one thing you talk about on this slide here, about how that you, as your students got into this project and they started seeing these images. I did notice myself on a couple of visits that students were so engaged in this project because it was kind of changing their perception of their community. Because so often for them, as they came into their community, you know, riding in the cars or on the buses, you know, they're not seeing as many businesses as used to be there. You see many empty houses and that kind of thing. So the students are really starting to connect with you know, not only the history of their community, but also Jenkins's role in the bigger historical narrative nationally. So that being said, then, speaking of national narrative, I notice here that you've made mention of COVID-19. So
unfortunately.
So talk a little bit about that, how that's impacted your grant and what you've brought up here.
Well, the timeline that I had planned out, we were just in our beginning stages of getting started with our research. We got a few days in, and bam, we're hit right in the face with this COVID. You know, and it's, you know, it's been said many, many times, this is unprecedented. It's been an interesting experience. One thing that I think that has became a good aspect of this, if there's one to find as far as our school goes, is even though we're not inside of the school building, it feels like our school has become closer together as students and teachers and, you know, co-workers, because we have had to really rely more on one another than previously, because like I said, there's so many things that it's just uncharted territory. And, us teachers for the students, we're there to help them navigate those waters. And as coworkers, we have all had to band together to get all this figured out so we could continue with our students' education. And I think that if anything bright comes out of all this, that is the thing for our school that has developed is a bigger sense of community within our, I don't want to say building now because it's not what it is. It's just a sense of community with the people that are involved.